She did not move when the wind shifted, even though the tumbleweeds scraped against her skirts and rattled like dry bones, because moving had been what got her seen before. She crouched low, knees pulled tight, one hand pressed against the earth as if it might hold her in place, counting breaths instead of steps now, because steps made noise, and noise led to questions she could not answer. Her mouth was dry enough to ache, the kind of thirst that stopped feeling urgent and started feeling permanent, and she told herself she would stand when the sun dipped lower, when the light softened and the land stopped exposing everything that tried to cross it. The prairie stretched empty in all directions, too open to hide properly, and she hated the tumbleweeds for offering only partial cover, for pretending to be shelter when they were nothing more than debris caught by chance. She had learned not to trust things that rolled. Her canteen lay empty beside her, its leather cracked, and she had shaken it twice already, knowing it would not answer, but needing to hear the silence to believe it. She pressed her forehead to her knees and thought of nothing, because thinking led backward, and backward was full of hands that did not ask before taking. The wind rose again, and this time it carried a sound that did not belong to it, a shift of weight, a deliberate step, and her body tensed before her mind could catch up. She did not scream. She did not run. She stayed exactly where she was because running had taught her how fast men could follow, and stillness had taught her how often people passed by without truly looking. A shadow stretched across the ground beside the tumbleweeds, long and steady, and she closed her eyes, preparing herself for whatever voice would come next, for commands or questions or the tone that pretended to be kind until it wasn't. When the voice did come, it did not ask her to stand or explain or show her hands. It said a name instead, spoken clearly, simply, as if introducing itself to an equal rather than addressing something cornered. She opened her eyes slowly and saw the Apache standing a few steps away, his hands empty, his posture relaxed, watching her without ownership or hurry. He waited until she met his gaze, then nodded once, acknowledging that she was still here, that she had not vanished just because she had hidden. Only after the name settled between them did he reach for the canteen at his side and loosen its cap, holding it out without stepping closer, offering water not as rescue, but as a choice. And in that order, name before mercy, she felt something unfamiliar steady her breathing, because no one had ever offered her recognition before survival, and the land around them, wide and unforgiving, seemed for the first time to pause and listen. He did not move closer when she did not reach for the canteen, and that restraint mattered more than the water itself, because it told her she was not being gathered up or guided anywhere without choosing it first. The tumbleweeds rattled again as the wind passed through, and she felt the urge to shrink return, the old instinct to make herself smaller than the land. But the Apache stayed where he was, weight settled evenly, gaze steady without searching her for reasons. He did not ask how long she had been hiding or where she had come from, questions that usually arrived before help like a toll to be paid, and the absence of them loosened the tight place in her chest just enough for her to breathe fully. She watched his hands, noticing how they remained open, how the canteen was angled so it could be taken without pulling. And that detail told her more than promises ever could. When she finally reached out, her fingers brushed the metal briefly, and she felt the coolness through her skin, grounding her in something real, something offered rather than taken. She drank slowly, careful not to show how badly she needed it, and he turned his gaze away while she drank, giving her the dignity of privacy even in the open, because being seen did not have to mean being watched. The water eased the ache in her throat, and with it came the sharp awareness of how close she had come to not being found at all, how easily the prairie swallowed those who tried to cross it alone. He spoke again only to say he had noticed the tracks circling back on themselves, the way a person walked when they did not want to be followed, and he said it without accusation, as observation. And she nodded once, relieved not to have to deny it. He did not tell her she was safe now, because safety was not something that could be declared out here, and she trusted him more for leaving the truth intact. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of dust and sun-warmed grass, and she realized she was no longer counting breaths, no longer listening for pursuit, because the stillness around them had changed shape. He asked if she could stand, not because he intended to make her, but because the question respected her body as it was, and she tested her legs carefully before answering, surprised to find strength enough to rise. When she did, he stepped back another pace, giving the movement room, and the simple courtesy steadied her more than his presence had. She stood there among the tumbleweeds, water still cool on her tongue, and understood that being found did not have to mean being chased, that discovery could arrive without demand, and that in this wide place, where most encounters ended in pursuit or fear, someone had chosen to meet her exactly where she was and wait for her to decide what came next. She realized she was still holding the canteen when he spoke again, not to ask for it back, not to hurry her, but to repeat his name once more, slower this time, as if making sure it landed where it belonged rather than passing through her like wind. Names had always come last for her, traded only after directions or demands, and hearing one offered so plainly unsettled her in a way that felt careful instead of sharp. She lowered the canteen and studied his face, looking for the practiced patience of men who waited only long enough to get what they wanted, and found none, just an even attention that did not lean forward. He said nothing else, leaving the space open in case she wished to answer with her own, and the quiet stretched without pressure, long enough for her to notice how the prairie hummed when she was not listening for pursuit. When she finally spoke, her voice surprised her with its steadiness, giving him a name she had not used aloud since leaving the last place she meant to forget, and he acknowledged it with a simple nod. No repetition, no attempt to test it for usefulness. The exchange felt complete without ceremony, and she understood then why the name had come before the water, because recognition was heavier than aid, and once given, could not be taken back without effort. He asked if she had a destination, not where she had come from, and she shook her head, honest in a way she had not allowed herself to be in days, because forward had been the only direction that did not hurt to think about. But he accepted the answer without comment, and told her there was shade not far off, a stand of cottonwoods where the ground dipped and the wind eased, and he said it as information rather than invitation, letting her decide whether to follow. She tested her footing again, and took a step, then another, feeling the strength return in increments, and he matched her pace without leading, staying far enough back that the tumbleweeds no longer scraped at her legs. As they walked, he spoke of the land instead of her, pointing out where water collected after rain and where it vanished into stone, offering knowledge the way he had offered his name, without asking for anything in return. She listened, the shape of his words grounding her in place rather than story. Yes, and when they reached the shade, he stopped at the edge and waited for her to step in first, a small courtesy that felt deliberate. She sat and let the coolness settle, realizing that trust had arrived, not in a rush, but in careful order, name before mercy, choice before shelter. And in that order she felt something she had not carried in a long time take root, the quiet understanding that being seen did not require surrender, and that sometimes the first thing given, when it mattered most, was not what kept you alive, but what allowed you to remain yourself. The shade softened the air enough for her shoulders to lower, and she noticed how her hands had stopped shaking now that she was not bracing for pursuit, how the thirst that had felt like a command a moment ago had settled into something manageable. The Apache set his pack down and loosened the strap without turning it toward her, careful not to make the water the center of the space, and that choice told her more than any reassurance could have. He waited while she drank again, slower this time, then closed the canteen himself and set it aside, signaling that urgency had passed and nothing more needed proving. She watched the dust settle at the edge of the cottonwoods and realized how often water had been used to hurry her before, offered with conditions attached or taken back when answers disappointed. Yes, and the fact that it could wait here felt like a quiet repair. He spoke about the land again, about how storms pushed tumbleweeds into lines that looked like shelter but never held, and she listened, recognizing the metaphor without needing it explained. When he asked if she could walk farther, his tone carried no expectation, and she answered honestly that she could if the ground stayed even, and he nodded, adjusting his route without comment. They moved on when she was ready, not when the sun dictated, and that small delay felt like the first decision she had made without fear pressing it. As they walked, she told him nothing of what she had fled, and he did not ask, understanding perhaps that stories given too early turned into currency, and currency always demanded repayment. The prairie opened again, but it no longer felt like exposure, because the choice of when to leave the shade had been hers. He pointed out a distant line where the land dipped toward a creek that still held water after dry weeks, and he said there was shelter there if she wanted it, framing the option plainly and leaving the rest untouched. She considered, feeling the sun on her face and the steadiness in her legs, and realized that trust had grown not from what had been offered, but from what had been withheld. When they reached a rise and paused, he stopped beside her rather than ahead, sharing the view instead of directing it, and the gesture carried the same care as the name he had given earlier. She looked out over the land, wide and honest, and felt the remaining fear loosen its hold, because water that could wait had taught her something essential. That mercy did not rush, and that when survival was no longer used as leverage, it left room for something stronger to take its place. She did not intend to tell him, and yet the land made room for the truth the way it did for water after a hard rain, opening small channels without asking permission, and she found the words rising before she had decided to release them. She spoke carefully, not naming places or men, but describing the feeling of being watched too closely, of kindness that arrived with expectation, of doors that closed only after they were used against her, and he listened without interrupting, eyes on the path ahead, as if the story belonged to the ground more than to him. She realized then that running had not been about distance at all. It had been about timing, about leaving before the shape of things hardened into something she could not step around. Deeren, saying it aloud, loosened a knot she had been carrying since the first night she slept under open sky. He did not respond with judgment or reassurance, did not tell her she had done right or wrong, because answers like that pinned stories in place, and she needed hers to keep moving. When she paused, searching for words that would not turn into confession, he nodded once, acknowledging the space rather than filling it, and she felt the relief of not being required to justify survival. The creek line appeared closer now, the air cooler, and she noticed how her stride had evened out, how the land no longer demanded her attention at every step. He asked only whether she wanted company a while longer or preferred to go on alone, and the choice felt genuine because he had already shown he would accept either without consequence. She considered the question honestly, feeling the pull of independence and the unfamiliar comfort of being accompanied without claim, and she answered that she would walk with him to the water and then decide. He accepted that without negotiation, adjusting his pace to match hers, and the agreement felt clean, not a bargain, but a pause. As the sound of running water reached them, faint but certain, she understood that what she had been running from had less to do with danger than with erasure, with being reduced to what others needed her to be in order to explain themselves. Walking now, with her name intact and her choices intact, she felt that erasure failed to keep up, left behind, somewhere among the tumbleweeds where it belonged. When they reached the creek and stopped, she crouched to touch the water, cool and real. Zwis, and she did not drink right away because the urgency had passed, replaced by something steadier, the knowledge that whatever came next would be entered by choice, not flight, and that was the first true distance she had put between herself and what she had been running from. They stayed by the creek longer than she expected, not because either of them needed rest, but because neither hurried the quiet that had formed, and she realized how unfamiliar that felt, to remain somewhere without the pressure to explain staying. The Apache crouched at the water's edge and washed his hands, careful and unshowy, then stepped back so she could drink without being observed, and the small courtesy carried more weight than protection ever had. She drank slowly, feeling the cold settle through her chest, and when she straightened, he did not ask if it was enough, trusting her to know her own measure. They spoke in pieces after that, not stories but observations, the way the land changed color toward evening, how birds chose the safest reeds without ceremony, how storms taught patience to those who watched instead of chased. And in those exchanges, she felt trust assemble itself, increment by increment, not demanded, not granted, simply practiced. When she shifted her weight, testing the ground, he adjusted his stance to keep distance without retreat, and the balance between them held a careful geometry that let her feel neither cornered nor abandoned. She noticed how often he waited before responding, letting her words settle into the space instead of competing with them, and that waiting made it easier to speak honestly when she did speak, because silence no longer felt like a trap. As the light softened, he asked if she wanted to make camp nearby or move on while there was time, and the question landed cleanly, free of assumption, and she considered it with the seriousness it deserved. She chose to stay by the creek, not because she feared the dark, but because choosing rest felt like claiming ground, she had long been denied, and he nodded, accepting the decision without turning it into agreement or obligation. He gathered a small fire carefully, keeping it low, and showed her where the wind would break without asking her to sit or stand, and the sharing of knowledge felt like another layer of trust laid gently in place. When night settled and the stars appeared one by one, she realized she had stopped listening for footsteps entirely, and that absence startled her because vigilance had been her closest companion for so long. Trust, she understood then, was not a sudden crossing, but a series of pauses honored, of boundaries respected, of needs met without being used as leverage. And as the creek whispered steadily beside them, she felt that slow learning take hold. Not as certainty, but as a quiet readiness to remain where she was without fear. Night settled fully, and with it came the strange relief of not being observed, because the darkness here did not feel like cover or threat, only absence of audience, and she realized how long she had lived, as if eyes were always waiting to claim her next movement. The small fire held steady, low and respectful, and the Apache sat far enough away that the space between them felt intentional rather than uncertain, a shared understanding that proximity did not need to close in to be real. She ate what little food she had without guarding it, noticing how her hands moved more easily now that she was not calculating how quickly she might have to stand or flee. And the simplicity of the act grounded her in a way she had not expected. He spoke rarely, and when he did, it was about practical things, how the wind would turn before dawn, where the creek swelled after rain, how to read the stars without naming them, and the absence of personal questions made the night feel safe. She listened, not memorizing routes or plans, but absorbing the tone of his attention, how it rested without seeking. And she understood that not being watched did not mean being ignored. It meant being trusted to exist without explanation. At one point she laughed softly at something he said, the sound surprising her with its ease, and it faded naturally without being examined, and that felt like another small victory. The prairie beyond the fire remained dark and wide, but it no longer pressed in on her, because fear fed on anticipation, and anticipation had been allowed to loosen its grip. He offered her the blanket without placing it over her shoulders, setting it within reach and stepping back, and she took it when she was ready, appreciating that even warmth had been offered without choreography. As the night deepened, they sat in companionable quiet, the fire shrinking, the stars brightening, and she realized that the absence of witnesses had given her something she had not known she needed, the freedom to be unremarkable. When sleep came, it did not arrive in sharp starts or half dreams, but steadily, and she rested, knowing that no one was measuring her worth by what she shared or withheld. In the early hours before dawn, when the fire was nearly gone and the world held its breath, she understood that no one watching was not the same as being alone, and that distinction mattered, because it meant she could remain exactly as she was without vanishing, held by the land and by a quiet agreement that did not need to be spoken aloud. Morning arrived without announcement, the light sliding gently across the creek and waking her before sound did, and she sat up slowly, surprised by how rested she felt, as if the night had been allowed to pass without guarding her dreams. The Apache was already awake, tending the fire's remains with quiet efficiency, and he nodded once when he noticed her stir, not as greeting but acknowledgement, and returned to his work without expectation. She wrapped the blanket around her shoulders and stood, testing her balance, and the land held steady beneath her. No rush, no demand. He showed her where the ground stayed, firm near the water, and where it softened after rain, offering knowledge as shelter rather than direction, and she accepted it with the ease of someone no longer bracing for cost. When she drank again, he looked away, and when she finished, he did not ask if she needed more, trusting her to know when enough was enough. They shared a simple meal without ceremony, sitting apart but aligned, and she noticed how the space between them felt neither empty nor charged, just open, a place where choice could rest without being tested. He spoke of a line of cottonwoods farther on where travelers sometimes stopped, saying it was a place people passed through rather than claimed, and the phrasing mattered because it left room for departure without erasure. She listened and felt the word shelter take on a new shape, not a roof or a promise, but the absence of pressure, the permission to remain until moving made sense. When she asked how long he would travel this way, he answered honestly that he did not know. And the lack of certainty felt grounding rather than unsettling, because it meant nothing was being arranged around her. He rose and packed with unhurried care, leaving his things where they could be seen, not gathering them away from her sight, and the transparency eased a tension she had carried so long she had mistaken it for vigilance. As they prepared to move on, he gestured toward the path and waited for her to step first, and she did, feeling the steadiness of choice return to her stride. They walked together a short distance, the creek fading behind them, the prairie opening ahead, and she realized that shelter without claim did not follow you. It stayed where it was offered, leaving you free to carry what mattered forward. When they reached the point where the trail divided, he stopped and turned slightly aside, creating space rather than instruction, and she felt the moment settle without urgency. She understood then that what had been given was not a destination or a debt, but a pause shaped carefully enough to let her decide what came next, and that kind of shelter, once experienced, stayed with you long after you stepped back into the open. She stopped where the trail split, the ground marked by nothing more than wear and intention, and felt the weight of decision settle without urgency, because for the first time in days, choosing did not feel like escape. The Apache waited a few steps back, turned slightly aside so she could think without being watched, and that courtesy mattered more than guidance ever could have. She considered the creek behind them, the cottonwoods ahead, the open prairie to the east, and realized that none of the paths felt like surrender, only direction. When she spoke, she did not thank him, because gratitude would have sounded like payment, and she did not want to turn what had been given into something owed. She told him where she intended to go, not as explanation but as statement, and he accepted it with a nod that carried no expectation of return. He reminded her of where the ground stayed, firm after rain, and where the wind cut hardest at dusk, practical knowledge offered without claim, and she took it as she had taken his name, carefully and without promise. She stepped onto her chosen path and felt the strange steadiness of moving forward without being followed, without needing to look back to measure distance. The prairie opened around her, wide and honest, and she realized that leaving without owing meant carrying the moment intact, rather than trying to repay it with words or loyalty. Behind her, she sensed him turn toward his own direction, the sound of his steps fading naturally into the land, and the absence felt clean rather than empty. She walked on at a measured pace, the sun warming her shoulders. The memory of water and shade still present without pulling her backward, and she understood that true help did not linger to ensure remembrance. When she paused to drink again from her own refilled canteen, she smiled faintly, recognizing the difference between dependence and continuity, between being saved and being seen. The land held her as it had before, but now it felt navigable rather than hostile, because choice had replaced urgency at its center. As the trail narrowed and the prairie rose gently ahead, she carried with her not obligation but alignment, the quiet confidence that came from having met another human without being reduced or claimed. Leaving without owing, she realized, was not forgetting what had been given. It was honoring it by moving on whole, and as the wind lifted and the grasses bent around her path, she stepped forward, knowing that nothing was being taken from her now, not her name, not her direction, not the right to decide what came next. She carried his name with her longer than the taste of water or the memory of shade, not because it bound her to him, but because it had been given freely, and free things tended to last. As she walked, the prairie unfolded without ceremony, grasses shifting with the wind, sky stretching wide enough to hold whatever came next, and she felt herself settle into the rhythm of movement without urgency, each step chosen rather than borrowed. She did not look back when the trail curved, trusting that what had passed did not need watching to remain real, and she spoke his name once under her breath, not as a summons or a promise, but as acknowledgement, a way of marking the moment without turning it into a story she would owe. The land responded with nothing more than its steady openness, and she welcomed that, understanding now that recognition did not require witnesses to hold. When the sun climbed higher and the heat returned, she paused beneath a lone tree and rested, noticing how her thoughts no longer circled the past for danger, how they moved forward instead, mapping possibilities without fear, pressing them into haste. She drank when she was thirsty, stopped when she was tired, and resumed when ready, carrying the lessons of the encounter not as rules but as confidence, the knowledge that dignity could be met in the open without being taken. In time, the tumbleweeds became only tumbleweeds again, no longer markers of hiding, and she passed them without shrinking, aware that the land had not changed, only her place within it. She reached a rise and looked out over the miles ahead, unfeeling the familiar pull of uncertainty but without the weight it once carried, and she realized that the name she remembered had done its work not by tying her to another path, but by anchoring her to her own. When she set off again, the wind moved at her side instead of against her, and she smiled at the thought that the first thing she had been given had not been water or shelter, but recognition, offered without demand. That order mattered, and it stayed with her as the day wore on, shaping how she met the land and whoever might come next. By the time evening softened the light and the prairie cooled, she no longer thought of herself as found or rescued, only as someone who had been met honestly and allowed to go on unchanged. The name she remembered did not echo or fade. It simply remained, quiet and intact. A reminder that sometimes the truest gift on the frontier was not survival itself, but the respect that came before it, and with that knowledge steady in her stride, she moved forward into what lay ahead, unclaimed, unafraid, and entirely her own. Out on the frontier, help is often measured by what is given, but sometimes what matters most is what comes first. He did not offer water to command gratitude. He did not offer shelter to create debt. He offered his name, and in doing so, returned hers. Redemption is not always loud. It does not always rescue. Sometimes it simply meets another soul without claim and steps aside. And on a land where survival is common, respect given freely is what changes everything.